You're listening to episode 172 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Author and teacher Dinty Moore speaks with us about his new book, The Mindful Writer, Noble Truths of the Writing Life. Our practice can manifest in many ways, really in everything we do. But that is a decision, a choice we have, and sometimes we don't take it, instead continuing on automatic pilot. So what happens when we apply that decision, moment by moment, to being mindful to our more cerebral endeavors? It's one thing to be fully present in walking meditation, sweeping the floor, or brushing our teeth, but what about something like writing? And how might our foundational understanding of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism impact what we write and our experiences in putting a book together? Dinty W. Moore is author of numerous books, including The Mindful Writer, Noble Truths of the Writing Life, The Accidental Buddhist, Mindfulness, Enlightenment, and Sitting Still, Crafting the Personal Essay, A Guide for Writing, and Publishing Creative Nonfiction, and the memoir Between Panic and Desire, winner of the Grub Street Nonfiction Book Prize. He now writes essays and stories. He has been published in the Southern Review, the Georgia Review, Harper's, the New York Times Sunday Magazine, the Philadelphia Inquirer Magazine, Gettysburg Review, Utne Reader, and Crazy Horse, among numerous other venues. Dinty lives in Athens, Ohio, where he grows his own heirloom tomatoes and edible dandelions, and teaches a crop of brilliant undergraduate and stunningly talented graduate students as director of Ohio University's BA, MA, and PhD in Creative Writing program. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice chocolate chai. Tea scientists, snap to, I've not seen this combination yet. And our guest today is Dinty Moore. Dinty, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm eager to speak with you about a couple of different books. You are the author of The Accidental Buddhist, Mindfulness, Enlightenment, and Sitting Still. And the book we're here to talk about today is your new one, The Mindful Writer, Noble Truths of the Writing Life. And before we get into that, what I'd like you to do is tell us a bit about your background.
I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania. I was raised Catholic. It was one of those northeastern industrial towns where it seemed like everybody was Catholic. You had your Polish Catholic neighborhood, your Irish Catholic neighborhood, your Portuguese Catholic neighborhood. I mean, that's an old story if you come from that part of the country. And I went to Catholic school for 12 years, taught by the nuns from first grade through the end of high school. In terms of my Buddhist journey, I know in college I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and I said, wow, this is going to change my life. I'm transformed. And, that lasted about 3 days. I tried to meditate. I tried to be a different person, and like so many people, I just failed. I just, couldn't keep it up. Somewhere in my early 30s, late 20s, early 30s, I was living in Philadelphia and took a meditation class from a woman who ended up being a bit of a quack. I won't go into too much detail there, but she would leave us in the attic to meditate, and I tiptoed downstairs at one point in her 3-story home because I had to use the facility, and she was watching cartoons while we were upstairs meditating. That kind of made me, it kind of made me stop and think whether she was the right teacher for me or not. And
it may depend a large part upon what cartoon she was watching.
Yeah, well, there was a smell of marijuana in the air too, which I'm just not sure she was as focused on our well-being as she was supposed to have been, or claimed to have been. And then, in 1995 or so, I was nearing 40 years old when I finally got very serious about Buddhism and started attending different retreats and meditation centers, and that's sort of how I got where I am now. I consider myself still a pretty lousy Buddhist. It's a learning process, but I work hard at it.
Yeah. Dinty, what was it that made you really integrate that practice to really start going on retreats and really throwing yourself into it a little bit more?
Just the dissatisfaction with my Catholic upbringing, and I don't necessarily have any interest in trashing another religion or faith tradition. It didn't work for me because of Catholic school. That Catholic school, I think, even if you're inclined to be a sort of person who might get some merit from or some comfort from what the Catholic Church teaches, Catholic school will just beat it right out of you. So I had such a negative feeling and anger about Catholic school and the Vatican and and the whole sort of organized the organized religion. It's always a problem when they organize it. So I had such a negative anger that I sort of went through my 20s just sort of drifting and not knowing or feeling anything. And I wanted something, and what little bit I heard and read, I know I read some Alan Watts early on. It just sounded like it made sense to me what these teachers were saying. So I finally said, you need to get serious. You need to you've always wondered about this, and it's now or never.
So how about the other side of your life that's part of this book and your other efforts that we'll talk about later, which is writing? Tell us about your background and interest in that, how that sparked in.
It's almost a very similar tale of a young man wandering around lost. When I was in high school, when I was young, I loved to read and I wanted to be a writer, but my dad was a car mechanic. My family had no standing whatsoever, and I kind of had it in my head that people who did serious writing all went to Harvard and all grew up on Cape Cod and all were in some way related to George Plimpton. I'm being funny, but it's the truth. It was like, well, I can't be a serious writer because I'm just some dumb kid from Erie whose dad works on Chevys. So I kind of got into, but I was good at writing. I was always good at writing. My teacher said, you're good at this. So I got into journalism, which again, I'm not here to trash journalism, but it wasn't, this was the old-fashioned sort of, you go to the city council meeting and you write an article about tax millage and the most, which streets are going to get repaired first. And then I sort of bounced out of that very early on. I mean, I got a job at my local newspaper, but it just wasn't interesting. It didn't sustain me. And all through my 20s, I went from job to job, to thing to thing. I studied acting in New York. I played around with independent documentary filmmaking. I waited a lot of tables. And when I was 30, I sort of said, well, you weren't good at that writing thing. And I started trying to write fiction and trying to write, literary work. And now I'm mainly write what's called creative nonfiction, which is a fancy word for literary nonfiction that, attempts to open up the world and make people think about it the way a good novel or a good poem does.
So with your new book, The Mindful Writer, there are a couple of buzzwords for people in a Buddhist community is mindfulness and the noble truths of the writing life. Of course, those are very charged for us and maybe not so much with necessarily a writing community that doesn't have that kind of background. What prompted you to write this particular book, and tell us about the book itself. What's in there?
Let's see. I'll start with, for many years, because I published, you mentioned an earlier book of mine called The Accidental Buddhist, which was sort of a hybrid memoir, my Buddhist journey combined with a look at Buddhism in America. This was in the 1990s. Buddhism in America, especially Buddhism in America that was taking place outside of New York and San Francisco. New York and San Francisco, the scene there is deep and wide, and people have written about it, and it goes way back. But Buddhism was popping up in Highview, West Virginia, and right outside of suburban Chicago and Alabama and central Pennsylvania and all these places that I didn't expect there to be a Buddhist community. Suddenly, they were showing up, and there were a lot of news stories at the time about like beat cops. I forget now if it was Baltimore or Chicago or Detroit, but I think it was Detroit. But just regular beat cops were learning mindfulness and breathing techniques to help deal with the stress, and children in some school district are learning mindfulness to help them deal with test anxiety. So I thought, wow, this is kind of interesting. Here we are. Buddhism is 2,500 years old. It's so imbued with various Asian cultural artifacts. How the heck is it ever going to fit in with Middle America? So this book is sort of about Buddhism in Middle America. People would read the book or find out that I had written the book, and they're always saying, "Oh, so you're a Buddhist? So how does that influence your writing?" And for many, many years, I had nothing but sort of stammering and stuttering and very unsatisfying answers to that question. Because of course, to be an artist or a writer, you're striving, you're trying, you're wanting, you're yearning, you're desiring, you're doing the opposite of sort of letting go in some ways. Yeah. But I knew there was a connection, and I finally realized that it's not so much that what I've learned from Buddhism, from trying to use the mental formations and lessons that go all the way back to the Buddha. It's not that made me write differently, but I think being an artist and being around artists and being someone who thinks a lot about where does artistic truth come from, opened me up to Buddhism. That the connection almost went the other way, but I find so many parallels between. Well, certainly mindfulness would be the main one. Obviously, paying attention is what a painter pays attention to color and light in ways that those of us who don't paint, who aren't visual artists, can only imagine. And and writers pay attention to depending on what they're writing about. A good writer pays attention not just to the world around them, but to the nuances of words and the rhythms of sentences. And so the more I started to explore that, I said, this is kind of an interesting subject to immerse myself in, at least in thinking about. So the book itself, which is quite a small book, by design, Wisdom has a series of these books that the format is quite small, is a series of quotes from a few quotes from Buddhist teachers like Thich Nhat Hanh, a lot of quotes from writers and artists who are themselves Buddhist, Allen Ginsberg, George Saunders, and a lot of quotes from writers and artists who aren't Buddhists, including Flannery O'Connor, the Catholic Southern writer who would probably punch me in the nose if she knew I'd put her in this book. But I find that the things they say about writing or inspiration or dedication or letting go of your work, so that the work itself can take over the page or take over the canvas. I find that the things they said resonate so much with a lot of Buddhist teaching. So it's sort of a conversation. Somebody referred to it as Zen koans, because I take these quotes and then I sort of unpack them and think about them. But it's sort of a conversation between me, since I'm the author of the book, and these various authors, various artists. Some of them are painters, some of them are dancers, and not all writers, but these various artists. A conversation, sort of exploring what is, how does mindfulness come to play in not just writing, not just writing the sentence or writing the paragraph or writing the page, but even the career of a writer, the life, the life of a writer. And again, the book is called The Mindful Writer, Noble Truths of the Writing Life, and most of the chapters I talk about writing, but you could just, if you wanted to, you could cross out the word writing and put painting or dancing or music, because it's really about the artistic process.
Yeah, that artistic endeavor and that base awareness, that mindfulness of the richness of the moment, and really embedding yourself in that. With the arts, communicating that, how you can convey that sense of that moment with an audience, whether it's writing or painting or dancing or other forms of art, that's really the talent and the skill.
Yeah, and the other part, and this is what I found fascinating, and hopefully it is what is most useful in the book. I'll let the reader decide that. It's not for me to decide. Is how much accomplished artists talk about the letting go, talk about not controlling the work, which, it's a contradiction, but life is a contradiction, and most things worth pursuing are contradictory in some way, or at least mysterious. They talk about, you can't control the work, you can't squeeze it too hard, or it'll fall flat on the page, or fall flat on the stage, or you'll squeeze all the life out of it. And I find that a very sort of Buddhist notion as well. The letting go, the being open to you have to start the sentence, or you have to start the page. You can't just sit there and wait for a book to write. There's not little elves that come at night and do your work for you. But once you start asking questions, it's almost you're almost listening as much as you're thinking and pushing to see where the work wants to go. I mean, fiction writers will talk about literally when they're in the middle of a novel and on good days. Many writers have bad days where you're just chewing on the pencil and hitting yourself on the side of the head. But many fiction writers will talk about on good days when it's like the characters start talking to them, the characters start suggesting the dialogue, the characters start suggesting where this book is going to go next, because if you've created somebody real on the page, then that person starts to know better than you who they are and what they want to do. It sounds almost a little airy-fairy, but it's not. It's just a matter of it's how the human mind works and how creativity works.
Well, there are deep complexities to our minds, and there's a lot going on under the surface. And I'm wondering, as you were describing this dialogue that artists have with their subject, with the moment, and how that presents as their characters, is that part of why you structured the book the way you did, as sort of a dialogue between you and other authors?
I could say yes, but that would be what they'll be like after the fact, saying, "Oh yeah, that was my brilliant idea." I structured it that way because it was sort of what came to me. It's like, well, I had these quotes, and I had been saving these quotes, and frankly, I have a habit of throwing inspirational quotes up on my Facebook page of all places, and I said, no, what can I do with these? Well, let me just think out loud on the page about them, and that was as much deep theoretical intent as that I had. If it works out that way, then I'll take credit for it. All of my best moves in life have been mistakes, or me, closing my eyes and falling backwards off the edge of a pool.
The letting go.
Yeah.
So, what were some of the challenges that you ran into in putting this together? Did you ever run into, the stereotypical writer's block, or were there things that really confused you that you ended up being distracted by? Or
yeah, I mean, one of the things. Well, the world is distracting, and all the more so. It seems, with technology today. One of the biggest problems was just narrowing it down. I had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of quotes, but I had to decide which ones to use, and I had to work hard not to repeat myself, or to be honest. I mean, I wrote a lot more than what ended up in the book, and when I realized which parts were just repeating themselves. I sort of took those parts out and put them in a drawer. So it was a winnowing down process. I mean, part of the message of the book is that there is no such thing as writer's block. I mean, there is, but there needn't be. Writer's block is just listening to the wrong voices. That's part of the noble truths. It's like dissatisfaction. The dukkha, the noble truth that says life is suffering. I've always thought that. I'm not a language scholar, but I always thought, life is suffering. That doesn't get at it for me. Life is dissatisfaction. Is the way I like to translate that noble truth. So in writing, or in any creative process, you can listen to the voices that say, "Boy, you're stupid. Boy, this is just junk you created this morning. Boy, you're not smart enough to ever create anything worthwhile. Boy, you suck." And we all have those voices. I'm sure anybody in any profession has some level of that. But it's your choice whether to listen to them or not. And the way I've always conquered writer's block is I expect my first draft to be horrible. I expect my third draft to be an utter mess, and I kind of keep reminding myself that if you just dive back in and just keep writing sentences, and eventually you write a sentence that surprises you, and you go, "Oh, wait a minute, that was interesting. I didn't even know that I was heading in that direction." And then you stop and you take that sentence and you go, "Okay, what am I going to do with it?" I'm not claiming that as I said earlier, I'm not claiming I don't have those bad days, or I just feel like, nothing's working for me today. But but the same thing there. It's like, well, I embrace those days. I celebrate those days. I say, not necessarily when they're happening, but I embrace those days. I celebrate those days. I'm convinced that I have to sit there for 3 days creating nothing for that fourth day, where I sit down and all of a sudden it comes streaming out of my fingers faster than I expected, faster than I can type sometimes. If I hadn't put in those days where it just felt like the slow drip, then that fourth day where suddenly the mind, you have an idea in the shower and you're downstairs, typing with your towel around your waist because it's all making sense all of a sudden. You don't have those days unless you have the bad days. It's all part of it's all part of life. It's all part of writing. When people say writer's block, it's the word block. It's like, no, writers have ebb and flow. But once you convince yourself it's a block, then it becomes a block. A block meaning a stopping place. If you just think of it as you just have to wait it out, then there is no writer's block.
As you're describing that process of ebb and flow, and that you wouldn't get to those wonderfully creative moments without going through the rougher times where it doesn't seem that anything's happening, it's much the same way with meditation, that we think we have bad meditation times. I don't know. There's no such thing as a bad meditation. It's all work that you're doing in progress, that you're going to have an ebb and flow and ups and downs. It's part of the ongoing process.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I can't put it better than that.
So let's turn from our dissatisfaction or dukkha to piti sukha, to joy. And what are some of the positive things that have come out of writing the book, and now that it's come out, some of the feedback you've had that has felt good to you?
Well, the simple best thing is when I run into somebody, they email me, or I run into somebody, at a conference or a reading, and they say, "That book's really been helpful to me." I teach for a living, and I don't make enough money from my books to live. I'm not Stephen King, so I will get an occasional royalty check, and I'll say to my wife, "Hey, we're going to go out to dinner this week." But it's not a multi-million-dollar writing industry I have going here. I live from my teaching salary. So the real satisfaction is when people say, that helped me. I'm really glad I read that book. It's exactly what I needed. I was working on a project and picked up your book, and it kick-started me back into writing. And I hear that every once in a while, and that's the most joyful or satisfying moment once the book's out in print, actually, the most satisfying moment for me as a writer is the process of writing. I mean, whatever I'm writing, this happens to be a book about writing, but I write books and articles and essays about other things. I'm always trying to ask a question and figure out what the right question to ask is, and to me, the purpose of literary work is to help us being the readers, think about the world in a way we hadn't thought about it before, or look at some phenomena in the world in a slightly fresh way, or just turn our angle, just a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right or up or down, just to offer new perspectives rather than, tell people what they already know or think they already know. So to me as a writer, the most joyful moments are when I realize I'm onto something. When I say, this is not just interesting to me, and this is part of this helpful process. It's not just interesting to me, but I think I'm onto something. I think this may interest other people. I think I could ask somebody to sit down for 10 minutes or 2 hours and spend time with this, and I wouldn't be cheating them, and so I don't know. It's I guess when a mathematician solves an equation or begins to solve an equation, it's that moment of, oh my goodness, this is working, that I find the most joyful. I love that aspect of the work, because it's just like just keep thinking and writing, and they become entwined, because most of the sentences I write are tentative attempts to see if I even believe what I just wrote down. So that accumulated activity finally bearing fruit is just a wonderful feeling.
Good. Well, you mentioned you do teach. You're the director of Ohio University's creative writing program, and I see on your website, and I wanted to make sure that I shared this with the listeners, that there are several opportunities to study with you coming up in 2013 in a number of different places, not just Ohio. Could you tell us just a couple of those so I can let the listeners know?
The Kenyon Review, which is a national literary magazine, has a summer conference in June in Central Ohio. I'll be teaching there. I'll be teaching in Vermont in August. These are various events for either 3 days or a week where writers come together and sit around a table and think about writing and think about ways to improve their writing or learn new ways of writing. And I get to do some of that during the summer, which is nice. Excellent.
Well, for folks who are listening, you can find out more about that on Dinty's website, dintywmoore.com, and that's, of course, linked on the episode page, but it's dintywmoore.com. I'd also like to mention another site on the book we've been talking about today, and that website is mindfulwriterbook.com. Dinty, before we close, what are you working on now? What's next?
I'm working on a collection of essays that ostensibly nothing mindfulness. No, there's no mindfulness or Buddhism in the title, or even in the content, though. But the reason I believe that in the Buddhist teachings and the Buddhist people often ask me about Buddhism. They want to know, when do I shave my head? Well, I don't. What color orange are my robes? Well, I don't have robes. They want to know about meditating, which I do sporadically and poorly, but I still try to do. To me, Buddhism is a way of thinking about the way you control your own thoughts, the way you control your own reaction to things, and a way of paying attention. So it's come to where whatever I'm writing about, I feel like I end up writing about Buddhism, even if I never mention the word or never mention the teachings or never mention anything. So this is a collection of essays, varied essays on a number of different topics. I don't even have a title for it yet. Buddhism has given me a way of looking at the world, so I think I guess what I'm trying to say is whenever I'm writing something, I sort of catch myself halfway through and say, "Oh, you're doing that Buddhist thing again." But it's not bad. Better that than not understanding it.
Excellent. Well, we'll certainly want to hear more about that, and if we can get you back on to speak about your earlier book, The Accidental Buddhist, we'd like to do that as well. Our guest today, Dinty W. Moore, Director of Creative Writing at Ohio University. Dinty, thank you very much for being here.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed the talk.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.